There are so many beautiful words we hear directly from the heart of the Messiah. Words of comfort like, "My peace I give you." Words of wisdom like, "No one can serve two masters." He gave us words of encouragement like, "Take heart, I have overcome the world." We hear words of hope directly from the Messiah. "Ask, and it will be given to you. Search, and you will find it." And then there is the mission statement. "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, teaching them everything I have commanded you." But how can all this be accomplished? By following one very important rule Yeshua gave us. You shall love the Lord your God, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. All of these words of comfort, encouragement, hope, wisdom, and mission impose on us the necessity of hearing one more very important truth from Yeshua himself, words relating to the end times. Our message to the world will be better received when our hearts are right with the Lord, meaning that we have His comfort and His hope and His directives and His mission in mind. But if we can incorporate the events around us, if we can turn to prophecy and point to the very signs that are facing us today, we have a stronger platform to shed truth to this world. And within this great oration of the Olivet Discourse, knitted in these end-time predictions and warnings, such as the coming of false messiahs, wars and rumors of war, earthquakes and famines, we are reminded many times over to stay alert, to keep guard, to be strong in these last days. Yeshua himself warns us of these things because of his great love and concern for us. So let's tune in and listen to these valuable and powerful words that echo from the Mount of Olives. Shalom.
Today we're starting a new section of the book of Mark. You can open up your scriptures to Mark chapter 13. This is a chapter dealing with the end times and with one of the most popular subjects, that is the end of the world. When would it occur, and what would be the signs of the end? This topic and these questions have fascinated man since the very beginning. Throughout history, many have attempted to come up with details and even dates. Multitude of visions and dreams have been recorded. So many books written, but what makes our text, our section today most exceptional is that these predictions have been given directly by Yeshua himself. This chapter of Mark 13 is like a hub of biblical prophecies in that Jesus gathers the many sayings of the Hebrew prophets and those of the New Testament prophets and wraps them together. With that important baseline, he then adds some great and new information along with precious advice and guidance covering the period of time from the moment actually he uttered these statements to the time of the second coming. So these prophecies concern actually every believer from all times. Technically speaking, do you know that the end times have already begun when Yeshua's kingdom's offer was officially rejected by the world with his resulting sacrificial death and resurrection? And as for the signs of this kingdom's age, this chapter will lay out for us. These have been clearly seen throughout these last 2,000 years with a marked increase in intensity, especially these days. A key term that we find in Yeshua's explanation of the end times is found in the Hebrew scriptures and profusely in Jewish writings and also in verse 8. In verse 8, when after listing the main signs, Yeshua says, these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. The term birth pangs, one word in Greek and Hebrew, conveys an increase of the number of signs and an increase in strength and intensity until he comes back. And this intensity can be seen and even felt growing in our planet today. So much so that even the scientific world has joined the prophets of the Bible to warn us of the impending wars and natural disasters ahead. As for these signs which accompanied the body of the Messiah throughout the ages, Yeshua lists 4 of them in Mark 13. We can briefly sum up these before we look at them in more details. First, there will be and there is the appearance of false teachers who are here called false messiahs or false Christ. Why? Because they tend to replace and take Yeshua's position of authority. These will increase with time, and this prophecy by itself, the first sign of the end time that Yeshua chose to announce, encourages us to stay close to him, close to his people, for false Christ will try to isolate every believer and redefine some major doctrines, as Yeshua said that they will even lure even the elect. This is in verse 20. Second, we will hear about the emergence of wars and rumors of wars. These have already been there, but as history testifies, these wars have markedly increased, especially since the return of the Jews into their own land, in Israel. Not too long ago, and as we can see it in First and the Second World Wars, which preceded the return of the Jews just for 3 years, by 3 years. The return of the Jewish people to their land was a major trigger to initiate the last part of the end times. Third, there would be natural disasters, such as earthquakes in various places. These also were always from the beginning, and today we realize their presence even more with new technologies, which allows the scientists to daily count them and measure them. But the Bible speaks of major earthquakes that are to come, accompanied with other destructive natural disturbances, such as, for instance, hailstones and floods in some cities. In the same time, dryness in other cities. We today can already feel these birth pangs with the world's climate changes. Fourth comes what usually follows the first signs, that is famines. Wars, natural disaster, and especially men's growing coldness of heart, which is also another sign, will cause not only spiritual but physical famine as well. And after these four signs, in Mark, Yeshua gives so many details concerning the moments just preceding his second coming, moments of such great intensity, a time of which he himself said, and even quoting Daniel in verse 20, unless the Lord has shortened those days, no life would have been saved. This statement is one of grace, I want to tell you. And it comes after God has given man the will to steer this planet, and the outcome is self-destruction, so much so that Yeshua will come to stop it. And when considering all these predicted calamities, we may also ask, why does God allow such difficult times to linger and eventually to increase in such a force? It is because he desired that every human being comes to a saving knowledge of Yeshua after seeing all those many signs around us, clearly proving that man cannot make it by himself. Every sign, every fulfilled prophecy is a call to salvation, a signal of grace. These birth pangs then become an indication of a new life to come, a new era of peace and harmony with God. This is what we have to look at. After all, these times, those explained here for us, are very short. Daniel speaks of only 7 years. John speaks of 42 months or 1260 days, and each day, each hour is counted and will not go beyond these times. But the new life in Yeshua is forever and ever. That is why God takes so long to resolve the problem of evil. Come to me, he says, because will come a day when man will not have this choice. And how then should we today, in the face of these increasing signs, how should we be? How should we act? It seems that this is Yeshua's main concern in these prophecies. The feeling that one gets when reading all these powerful prophecies is that Yeshua is much more concerned about how we live and how we grow in our sanctification than all these details that are given. For instance, throughout this chapter, there's one thing that Jesus repeats over and over. He speaks to every believer. He gives what we may call the 12 warnings of Mark 13. It is all about how we respond to these signs. He warns us of the coming of those many false teachers. He tells us in verse 4, see to it that you are not misled. He is so concerned for our spiritual growth and walk on the narrows. He spoke of wars and rumors of wars. He tells us in verse 7, do not be frightened. God is always and will always be sovereign, and even more at such a time when danger lures over his lambs. We need to trust him. And he asks us in verse 9 to be on your guard always, for we ought to do our part of fighting. And he adds in verse 11, do not worry, he says. For every day we ought to run to him for faith and strength in prayer and his word, in fellowship, and always with a servant's heart. In verse 21, we see him always concerned to see if one lamb might fall into the mouth of these deceptive teachers. And so he says, don't believe them. Check them out. And towards the end, even his warning intensifies. In verse 23, he says, but take heed. In the same verse, he says, behold, I have told you these things. And again in verse 33, he tells us, take heed. And in the same verse, he adds, keep on the alert. And in the next verse 34, he adds, stay on the alert. And again in the next verse 35, he says, be on the alert. And again in verse 37, the last verse, his last word in the prophecy, be on the alert. You see how he repeats it? We can see through the strength of these repetitions, right, that Yeshua is really concerned for each of us, and that everyone who belongs to the family of God is called to action, to search, to know, and to increase in his or her relationship and knowledge of God, and especially in these times. And it is at this point when the disciples actually ask a two-part question we find in verse 4. See what it says. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled? First, they ask when the temple will be destroyed. And second, they ask what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled. Matthew helps us to know what they meant. There the question is, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world? Matthew 24:3. What then are these signs leading to the second coming of Yeshua that we need to know today? Yeshua doesn't give any dates, but he begins by giving a general prophecy covering the time preceding his coming, a time that lasted so far 2,000 years, by specifying in verse 8, these things are merely the beginning of the birth pangs. By using the expression birth pangs, we understand that these signs will increase in intensity and in frequency as we move towards the end. And then he brings us right into the tribulation with very specific warnings toward the end of the chapter. Let me give you a summary of this very important and powerful prophecy from Yeshua in Mark 13. Here in verse 1 to 2 opens the prophecy with the destruction of the temple. Verse 3 to 8 contains 4 stages of prophecy covering the time preceding the end, and as well as covering the time of the church, that is our time, the last 2,000 years up to today. While the end times began in the first century, its intensity and force will increase. That is, the signs' intensity and force will increase in the last days. We continue on with verses 9 to 13, which is a prophecy containing a word of comfort to those who will undergo the tribulation, but also for those who are victims of actually religious abuse. Verse 14 to 20 are prophecies that are particularly for those who will be living in Israel, in Jerusalem at the time. These prophecies will stand as a sign for others, and today we can see these things rising in front of our eyes, and especially this growing hatred against Israel, there and around the world. And then verse 24 to 32, so important a section, Yeshua then speaks of the way the second coming will occur. They are giving some very specific predictions in the manner in which he will come back. All these prophecies complete those spoken of by the Hebrew scriptures, prophets, and those by John, especially in the book of Revelation, and those of also Paul. Let us begin by considering the first thing that Yeshua says, and this is very revealing for us. In our last study, we mentioned 4 things he begins with. Remember? There are 4 things that have characterized the last 2,000 years, but they will increase again in strength and frequency. The first one is the appearance of false messiahs, false prophets, and false teachers. The second are wars and rumors of wars. The third are natural disturbances. And 4 concerns famines and coldness of heart. Let us look at the first one in more detail. It is for us today. The first thing in terms of warning which Yeshua addresses is, see to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name saying, I am, and will mislead many. Now, I want you to notice that while we are in the midst of an important and end-time prophetic chapter, Yeshua's first concern is about our spiritual growth. And I think this is wonderful. Yes, it is good to know about all the wars and natural disturbances, but first and foremost, don't forget your relationship with God, which needs daily to be fed and refreshed, and which needs to grow. That is our first order. And at the end, this is what will save those who will go through the midst of the fire. This is what we will see and feel and notice in us. At the end, Yeshua said, by the way, in verse 13, the one who endures to the end will be saved. This means that the mark of the one who is saved is the one who endures. He is persistent. He remains in his faith. And the reason is because this one has worked out his sanctification. He's worked out his salvation daily and constantly. The same rule applies to all believers of all times. Again, the point then is that whatever we do, let us not neglect our growth with God. Let us not neglect making all the necessary daily efforts and commitment to walk the right and narrow path. And did you know that the end of this set of prophecies, by the way, in the Gospel of Matthew, Yeshua closes with the parable of the 10 virgins and the parable of the talents. Why? Both emphasize the importance of staying close to God in whatever circumstances we may be. Let us go back to the second, third, and fourth warning found in Mark 13, verse 7 and 8. Let me read this for you. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be frightened. Those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will also be famines. These things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Now, we're moving away from the signs of the end time of the church and into the world itself, which will validate that these signs are getting more and more obvious around us. Wars and rumors of wars. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, is what Jesus says. Considering the lapse of time that separated us from the moment that this prophecy was given, more than at any time in history today, we can really appreciate and understand what the scriptures are warning us about. It was only 85 years ago when we saw nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom during the World War II, which lasted from 1939 to 1945. For the first time, over 40 nations were involved in war, and about 60 to 100 million people have died in the period of 6 years, something that was never seen before. This is when the prophecy began to intensify. And it did not stop after the war. Since then, there were constant rumors of wars and more wars. It has been estimated that between 1945 and 1989, around 20 million people were killed in 91 wars. But at the same time, a most powerful prophecy was being fulfilled with the return of the Jewish people to their home. This happened just 3 years after World War II. The rebirth of Israel in 1948 could be considered the trigger of the beginning of the last end-time prophecies. This fulfilled prophecy is even more amazing when we consider that Though the aim of the Nazi regime in Germany was to annihilate all the Jews, completely the Jewish race. But lo and behold, though they killed a third of them in Europe, 6 million Jews, God raised a rest who went back to their promised land and built what is today a powerful country that is the state of Israel. This is also prophesied by Jesus when he spoke about, what he will speak about the fig tree in verse 28. He says, now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaf, you know that summer is near. But why the fig tree? The fig tree is related to Israel. It is a symbol of the nation of Israel. In a previous prophecy in Mark, the fig tree withered. But today, it is up and healthy. And here Yeshua says that when you see the fig tree covered with leaves, you know that this age is coming to an end. Luke speaks of the fig tree and all the trees, he says, probably signifying the other nations, for at the same time as Israel came back, these other nations that will play a major role in the end time arose: Russia, Iran, European countries, and Asian countries. So World War II and Israel represent one powerful point in the historical prophetic calendar in the scriptures. And notice that Yeshua speaks of leaves covering the fig tree, not fruits yet. Why? Because Yeshua is not yet king of Israel. He is not yet king of this world. This follows the prophecies of Ezekiel, when the Lord predicted the return of Israel before the end, if you remember, in the valley of the dry bones in Ezekiel 37. When the prophet saw the bones coming together, he was surprised. And he said, and I looked, and behold, the sinews were on them, and the flesh grew, and skins covered them. But there was no spirit. Where's the spirit? The Spirit is the spirit of grace and of supplication that will be poured out on all Israel when the Messiah comes back. So they will look upon him whom they have pierced. That would be at the end, as we read in Zechariah 12:10. This is why Israel is back today in unbelief. For the end-time prophecies to come about need a nation of Israel, and they need a temple that will be built very soon. And so the characteristics of our time today is wars and rumors of wars, and when nation will rise against nation, as we have seen in World War II, and it will be at the end, but it will not be 40 or 60 million people who will pass away. But all the nations actually will be gathered together. It was Will Durant. In his 11th book on the history of civilization, he wrote that out of 3,400 years of written history, he calculated that there was only 168 years of peace. That is 0.5% of the time. I want to tell you, Jesus meant what he said. There will be wars and rumors of wars. Today it seems that the nations cannot wait. There are plenty of near-miss situation between the superpowers. US and China, Russia and NATO. We can expect an increase of these near misses, but the Lord is sovereign. It will be only when he decides. But as far as we believers and as are concerned, okay, see what Yeshua says right in the midst of these prophecies. Do not be afraid. Don't be frightened, right? For he is again completely sovereign over these things, and we have nothing to fear should we stay close to him. Amen? This was the second sign. The third sign speaks of increased earthquakes. You know, our English word earthquake is defined as a sudden and violent shaking of the ground, and so it is confined to the moving of the earth. Not so in the Greek. It does not contain the word earth, by the way, in it, but the word shake, the word commotion. The Greek word includes in it more than just a shaking of the ground, but it includes other natural disturbances as well. The word is used in Matthew 8:24 to describe a storm in the sea. The word storm is actually earthquake. And so this word goes beyond what happens on the ground. In secular Greek, they also used it to describe social disturbances, which we see around us, and emotional turmoil, and physical discomfort, and even describing extortion and blackmail. This is how far this word goes. So this word would include great disturbances of many kinds, and we can include within these warnings natural disturbances. Have you noticed how hot it is outside, by the way? Have you noticed that the weather changes have been lately, that is? Just last Monday, the global temperature reached the hottest ever recorded, only to be broken the following day with an even higher number, 17.18 centigrade, or 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, this is, by the way, an average of temperature found across the planet, including Antarctica and the North Pole. It's a global temperature, and it is high. Also, the UN warns that the next 5 years are expected to be the hottest period ever recorded. What it tells us is that our earth is heating up, and God is allowing it so that perhaps some will notice Him, who is the creator of this planet. These are among the many signs, and it seems that even the universe, I want to tell you, and I love astronomy, the universe is telling of the times. You know, I read that astronomers have spotted the largest cosmic explosion ever witnessed. The research team determined that the incredible luminous event was nearly 100 times brighter than all the 100 billion stars in our Milky Way galaxy combined together. And it's happening now. David wrote in Psalm 19, "The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of His hands." And today they are still talking to us, but this time they are telling us that God's protective hand is about to be slowly removed from this earth. Man has constantly pushed God away from him, and now that God is moving away, see what the results are: war, natural disasters, natural commotions. And there's yet another fourth sign: famines. You know, there are a few synonyms for famines in the Greek, but this word, limos, it denotes acute lack of food. This is the outcome of wars and natural disturbances, and also of man's growing cold heart towards the other, a lack of love. One may ask, how could there be people suffering from hunger in our advanced age? While we are technologically, scientifically so advanced, the heart is still the same. This is why every man needs to know who Yeshua is. They say that today there are approximately 193 million people who are experiencing acute hunger. And it's estimated that in 2023, there are 345 million people who currently suffer from hunger and malnutrition spread in 79 countries. But there's enough food. Did you know that? There's enough food to feed the whole planet. This is just a reflection of the heart of man in the end times. To sum up these four signs, let me read you how the Spirit of God inspired Paul to write this powerful section on the end times, and this is in 2 Timothy chapter 3, where we find 18 characteristics of man in the last days, things actually we'll witness more and more. But know this, that in the last days, Paul says, perilous time will come. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power, and from such people turn away. This then is what to expect. Yes, in the increase also. Blasphemy is lawlessness against God. Less and less people will believe in God. Faith will decrease, it says. Disobedience to parents is lawlessness in the family. And notice this one, unloving. That is without natural affection, inhuman, heartless, where we read a lack of natural family affection. Now I want to end this study in a positive note, as prophecies of the Bible always do. Ultimately, Bible prophecies promises a great age of harmony and happiness, but despite these wars and disturbances, there's still a powerful touch of grace right here in Mark chapter 13. Where do we find it? Look at verse 10. The gospel must first be preached to all the nations. That is the wonderful news of this chapter. No matter what is happening around, no matter how the forces of evil would want this world to go down, God will use this time to proclaim the good news of the salvation we have in Yeshua. And today, I want to tell you, He has begun to do it. While there's a marked degeneration and corruption of biblical values around us, there are some great people that the Lord has raised and who staunchly and courageously proclaim the Word of God, and they do it so well. We have seen many come to believe lately, and many interested in the Scriptures. This also is a sign of the end, and this will increase as well. But the greatest revival ever in history is yet to come, and it will occur during the darkest moment the earth will undergo, and this is after the rapture, during the time of the tribulation. At this time, right after the time of the tribulation begins, John in the book of Revelation in chapter 7 is given a vision of those who will be saved, and listen to what he saw. And a great multitude, which no one could count, from every nation and all tribes and people and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, and palm branches were in their hands. Verse 9. As the Antichrist will be ruling the earth, John sees people from all the nations of the world gather in heaven and come out of the great tribulation. They come from everywhere. They are from different nations and tribes and people who spoke different tongues and are gathered in one faith. And do you notice what they have in their hands? Palm branches. But why palm branches? This is a symbol of the millennium. This is a symbol of the Messianic times. These were there waiting for the establishment of the kingdom of Yeshua to come down and to rule with Him. See that where sin abounds, the grace of God abounds even more.